The focus today, when Holly and I were working on this last year, and it was really Holly's idea at the beginning, and I just sort of rode on her coattails. The idea was, there's three things that are, either always take a lot of oxygen in the room, or just because of changes in the landscape, changes in the technology, ecosystem, are taking a lot of oxygen at the moment. And those three things are the rise of Gen Z and Alpha in the workplace, adding to the large breadth of generational representation we have right now. Second silo number two being AI. Funny, lots of conversation going on around that topic. And silo number three, of course, always a conversation, but especially a lot the last few years, corporate governance. You can find a lot of panels, a lot of conversations, a lot of writing on these three things, but you don't really run into a lot where they are discussed together and where we really look at that Venn diagram of how all three overlap and what is there to uncover as a director and a senior executive in that overlap. And what can we discover when we really look at those three things holistically together? Instead of, and of course, it's good to look at them in their independent silos, but we're going to focus on that Venn diagram today. So with that, we're going to get rolling. And I'm actually going to start, Shubi, I'm going to start with you. And I think the way we'd like to kick it off today is, I already alluded to the fact that we're all talking about AI. Let's go on and put the assertion out there that it's not optional. It is absolutely something that every company and every board need to deal with and interact with to some degree. We know that it has some ethical and moral concerns. We also have a couple of generations in the workforce, primarily Millennials, Z, and Alpha upcoming, who are very vocal and very focused on ethical and moral issues. How do you think about the implications of that combination right now in the landscape?
When we think about our millennials, and especially the younger millennials and the Gen Z, it's really barbelled because on one side, they are truly digital natives and they're used to being on all these various platforms and sharing information. And they recognize that it extracts their data, but they're very comfortable in that space, right? And if you sort of bring that mindset into the work and you think about now AI and for a second, let's just assume that all this unstructured data has been brought together. And now we're thinking just focusing on data and the ethical implications of that. This is where I think we find the differences emerge, right? Because you have this younger generation that has sort of grown up with that mindset of, oh, how should I be thinking of data? Because I personally been okay with it. So that's one side of the barbell. But the other side of that barbell is the same youngsters, so they're very focused, right? I mean, maybe don't know whether ESG is a good word today or not, but setting that aside, they are much more ethically aware and they do care about the consequences of what happens to the consumer base or to the employees or to the shareholders. So you really, so if you think of it like as a classic pyramid, what you're seeing now in the workplace is this sort of barbelled population who also, if you think of it from that perspective, they're coming in, they're learning about, their processes, their systems, their teams in that organization. Then you have sort of the layer in between, which is the middle management who understands what it means to run teams and be able to connect the dots. And then you have the board and senior leaders who have that financial acumen, the strategic acumen, the business acumen, but the digital acumen might be very different than the acumen at the more Gen Z and the younger millennial population. So it's a horizontal issue and it's also a vertical issue. As you were saying earlier, like that Venn diagram, in bringing these generations together, but to really focus on this the ethical implications, but it really starts out with just getting everybody on the same page, because I think there's such a broad spectrum across these generations and how each one of them thinks about the ethical values of that data. So that's where I think the tone has to start at the top in terms of where the guardrails are, what's going to be acceptable, how are we going to protect the data, etc. But and communicating that, and how does that then intersect with your code of conduct that you have in the organization? So all of that has to sort of get pulled together so that it's very consistent, and that's a big piece of work, actually.
Yeah, so that's the takeaway for today. That's enough to be going on with. Have a great rest of your day. And there is, as we were thinking about what's evolved since the first time we did this panel, one thing we've actually had the chance as well over the last months to start to see what's worked and what hasn't for companies. And there's a case study that I ran across a month or two ago of a company where, in order to deal with some of these tensions that you mentioned, these polarities that we have to manage, it was a catering company. And as you can imagine, their business was really upended in both good and bad ways during COVID. And with the advent of improved machine learning AI capabilities, this catering company started to experiment and roll out the use of AI to better plan their food supply, their customer interactions, their planning, et cetera, in the metro areas in which they work. The first mistake they made was they brought in a team of 5 experts. They hired away from Amazon and brought them in to do the first pilot in Atlanta of how AI could help. It went okay. The team did a great job. They uncovered some efficiencies, they saved some money, and they also completely alienated the entire workforce in Atlanta, who were absolutely scared to death. So the company, to their credit, listened, talked, thought about the topic, thought about how to balance these polarities and these implications. And in their follow-on cities, they didn't bring in experts and just put them in a closet and say, okay, go do this. They brought in one advisor per city, but then they created working teams in their other metro areas made up not only of existing employees, but employees of different ages to work on the implementation of these ideas in their other metro areas. They saw a much better result, of course.
Right.
They found the same business savings, but this time they didn't alienate the employee base. Always a bonus, right? So, Holly, with your unique background as an HR professional, you've seen this in a lot of different ways. What are some of the implications of working not only with AI, but with AI across all these generations that you want to talk about?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to talk to this group. I think the landscape has changed tremendously. I look at the role of the CHRO today, and CHROs that I'm talking to and CEOs I'm talking to. If you just go back 5 years, they weren't talking about hybrid workforce. They weren't talking about the pandemic. They weren't talking about employee activism. They weren't talking about major mental health issues inside of the corporation. And they weren't talking about managing a workforce that was also made up of machines. And what does that mean? They weren't thinking about millennials and Gen Z being 50% of the US workforce right now. And they weren't thinking about, in 5 years, 75% of the US workforce will be Alpha, Millennial, Gen Z. So I think the other sort of thing that I'm thinking about as I think about these intersections is millennials and Gen Z stand to inherit the largest transfer of wealth in the history of the United States. They are activists, they're social activists, they're employee activists. So they'll eventually become investors, and they may become your shareholder activists. So all of these things in the minds of the CHRO are, and CEOs right now are top of mind. And so how do you create strategies? How do you create communication plans? How do you create change plans to deliver shareholder value?
Mm-hmm. We've mentioned, and I think we've mentioned a couple of times, that Holly's not only been a CHRO 5 times, but she's also speaks 5 languages. And 5 is the number of generations we have out there right now. It's soon to be 6 because Alpha is starting to get their first jobs. We've talked quite a bit about this tripod and all of these different generations. Is there anything that we haven't brought up yet that you want to highlight so that we don't over-rotate too much to the Alphas and the Zs, and we still think about the Boomers and the Xs that are in the workforce? Holly, I'll start with you.
Well, I'm going to go there. So Joanna and I have this very funny conversation around these two words, psychological safety. And we grew up in a generation where nobody really cared about our psychological safety as we were coming up. So we do a little bit of an eye roll, but I'm also going to say, I think this is a very human concept, and it doesn't matter what generation you're in. There's a lot of fear right now for employees of all generations. And if you ask my 21-year-old, like her version of psychological safety and the words she would use to describe it, they'll be different than mine. But for me, when I think about this, this is a business imperative. And transformation is what most companies are trying to do right now. And transformation will happen at the speed of trust. And so when you can create, using the words psychological safety, which happen to be very popular right now, when you can create trust in an organization, you can move at the speed of light, which then impacts your business. And when people get fearful, regardless of what generation they're in, they contract, they may not leave. They may just sit down. They're not giving you their hearts and minds. And thus, you're not getting the business outcomes. And there's a real from my perspective, there's a real financial implication to this churn. When you churn people that fast, it costs money to hire them, for them to onboard. Your customers are affected because you lose institutional knowledge, you lose the relationships. So that's the one thing that I think spans all of the generations that, it's sort of been, I think, talked about as a very touchy, soft subject, but I think that there's some real financial and business implications to when companies do it really well and create that communication, trust, and transparency.
And that may be another place where verbiage matters.
Yes.
Because I'll go on it a bit as a right smack in the middle Gen Xer. When I started hearing psychological safety, I was one of those eye rollers. And like Holly said, like nobody cared about mine when I was 21 years old in a all male workforce, whatever. But I think that's an interesting thing to be aware of, because that term will mean something to a lot of our younger employees. We still need to deal with the psychological safety of our older employees, but we may call it something different.
Correct.
So it's just interesting. There's so much nuance in this space, but it comes down to the fact that every employee wants to feel relatively safe where they are. They're going to do better work that way as well.
But I would say, Joanna, that the climate we are in right now, and I think this is sort of globally, it feels like there are just so many unknowns. And when you think about when Elon Musk took over Twitter, he reduced the workforce by almost 70%. And most people went, this is crazy. That how is this company going to survive? And actually, I think he set a huge trend. And if you listen to a lot of earnings calls, companies are saying we're restructuring. You are seeing that, but you're not seeing them saying, well, we're restructuring because of cost initiatives, et cetera. Oftentimes, it is because they're reinvesting those dollars into their AI initiatives, right? And so we're beginning to see those dollars actually rotate. And so as a result, it's become much more of a employer market as opposed to an employee market. There's been a huge shift now. And then the Gen Zs and the younger millennials, those jobs are probably more best suited for automation. If a company is going to really, get into the AI world, like that's probably the first place, the easiest place to get in, the low risk place to get in. And so I think there. And again, of course, what we're seeing, that what's happening even in the government space today, there is this huge huge impact on psychological safety for people, not just because of AI, but just AI, the whole shift in thinking about the size of the workforce, the shape of the workforce, and how and where are we adopting AI.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they're just, even at the board level, frankly, how do you do a 5-year plan when you don't really know how the velocity of where technology is going to go?
Yeah. And I think that is such a great point. And in fact, there's some great materials available on the NACD website, some really good articles, especially if you search for any of the materials that were tied to the VRC program recently in Houston on January 31st. Or if you look up some of the articles that Ryan McManus has written in collaboration with NACD, there is a lot about, how do you develop an AI strategy that yes, it is an enterprise strategy, but you know it's not going to be 5 years and you know it's not going to be perfect when you roll it out. And so maybe Jen, Maya, and Chinya, maybe we share a couple of those articles with this, because I think, again, there's some Venn diagramming here going on. One of the greatest things that Ryan writes in his articles about how you develop an enterprise AI strategy in the current time is you accept that it's going to be iterative, and you accept that you're going to try a lot of things. Some of them are going to work, some of them are not. Even the ones that work will probably need a little bit of editing as you go through them. But the pursuit for perfection before implementation is something that we're going to have to give up. And if anyone is familiar with the concept of agile programming in software development, that's very much what we're talking about here. If you just look up what are the principles of agile development, what it says is directly applicable, I think, to developing AI strategies right now. And I love Holly threw a little quote in there, but I really liked this. And I heard Andrew Krastowski say it one time that, technology transformation will happen at the speed of trust. And I love that. When I kind of sit on that a little while, it's easy to think, it's going to happen at the speed I tell them it's going to happen. Well, maybe not. It'll probably be faster if the employee base trusts you a little bit. And I think that's kind of an interesting one to sit on and think about. Yep. What does it actually mean to my company, right? While still avoiding, analysis paralysis and that everybody has to be kumbaya and happy before you do anything. Sorry, that's my Gen X coming out again. I'm going to touch on a phrase that at first when I started hearing it, I didn't love either. And it's the phrase digital native. I remember when we first started talking about that one, it just seemed so, trite, right? But there is something to it. There is something to the idea that a very significant and growing part of our employee workforce is just intuitively super comfortable with digital technologies. They have a better ability to more quickly see how they can be used, a more intuitive ability to take something and figure it out and utilize it. Whereas, I find myself still sitting there with the tap and the credit card, like, acting like my grandmother, There is something to that. And companies can harness that. We can harness that for good as we develop product, as we roll things out to our customer base. So how do we, especially as senior executives, how do they take the best of these skills and these intuitive capabilities in the younger workforce and tap into that as a strength in their business plan?
So I think what the senior leaders have from experience and expertise over the years is judgment. And the more younger generation are digital natives, but they're still learning and they don't have the judgment as yet. And I think this is where the two or those multiple generations come together. A really good example would be, and this is actually in your space, which is, we have with AI and the fact that you're actually taking a lot of this unstructured data that might be sitting all through the organization, pulling it all together, pre-processing it, cleansing it, so that you can get really great insights, right, for predictive analytics and all those fun things. But when you do that, all of a sudden, you also made yourself now open to somebody attacking that data, or so you have to protect it. You're using all these interesting tools around encryption, public key, private key, and that's great because today we still live in a binary world, which means that, if a computer were to try to hack that public-private key, it would take them years and years to do that with the present technology. But we will have something called as qubits in about 5 years or so. And that's a whole different technology with parallel processing, et cetera. But what that will do is it will be able to break into those systems in minutes, right? So as senior leaders now, we have to really think about how much do I really invest? How do I invest? And at the same time, think about where I need to be in 5 years, because all this technology that I'm putting in place today to protect all of this data, I'm going to have to throw this this way, and it's expensive. Joanna is a very expensive person to hire. Right? So this kind of is very expensive.
Cost center.
Right? So we're a huge cost center. And so again, going back to that generation, they're real great digital natives. They'll go out, they'll fortify the systems, they'll do everything. But this is where the experience and the expertise comes about, and then in terms of the judgment and how do we invest, where do we invest, what is that sort of 80-20 rule? How much risk? And that's a big thing for the board as well. What is our risk appetite? Defining that risk appetite and being able to then get the team to work within that risk appetite.
So I would say a couple of things. You talked about agile thinking, and I think that this applies to any function. This is not just applied to product development. So if you're working on a board and you aren't seeing evidence of deep curiosity, experimentation, evidence of doing experiments and failing and learning from those experiments, I would push on that. The concept of letting, allowing, and demanding that your younger digital native workers are a part of building solutions is something that I think is incredibly valuable. It brings them into the fold. You get ideas that you never, or at least I would have never thought of, using them to do hackathon, ideathons. I built, at the last company I was at, we built values and behaviors and expectations, and we used half of the employee base to build it. And they bought it because they built it. And it resonated for the senior team and for the board in a way that I don't think it would have. So I think that's really important. If your board doesn't have these skills, as you're doing board refresh, start thinking about what kind of skills matrix do we want to have on this board. And it's probably not narrow, it may be broader, but if each time you do a board refresh or a board seat refresh, really ask yourself, have we looked at this particular dimension?
And we're just about to dive into skill sets, both in the board and in the enterprise.
Perfect.
I've heard what you mentioned about letting/allowing, demanding. I like that. The younger workforce into product design, product development, et cetera. I've heard that called intrapreneurship, which I love that term actually, because it is very descriptive of using the intercapabilities in what you've got for entrepreneurship within your company. Two other things that I've run across that I think are worth highlighting are, number one, I think it's a really good time to revisit where we as directors and executives get our information and what news we look at. I'm definitely of the demographic where I get my Wall Street Journal delivered every morning. I've got Washington Post and New York Times on my phone. Like, that's what I read. And, yes, those are good, but they're no longer enough anymore. There are so many alternative media out there that especially younger people are using as their primary media. What my primary is probably their secondary or their tertiary, and vice versa. A lot of ideas being shared and discussed on Substack, so much happening now on various podcast and YouTube channels. I completely missed during the run up to the election how much was happening on these YouTube channels that young men were listening to, for example. So I think it's important for us to be broadening where we get information so that we understand what our employee workforce is being exposed to, or we're just going to miss out on ideas. One other thing, and I'm not exactly sure yet how this translates to enterprise boards and especially for-profit or publicly traded boards, but I've heard recently about more than one nonprofit board who has started keeping rotating seats for younger people. And in fact, a friend of mine who's on a nonprofit board here in Austin focused on housing, they call it their rotating millennial seat. She was laughing recently. They're going to have to rename it, though, because their millennials are getting older. They're going to name it the rotating Z seat next. But what they do is on an every year basis, they bring in a volunteer who works with their nonprofit, and they have them sit with the board. They don't have voting capability. They, of course, don't carry all of the same obligations and demands of a full director, but they're there so that the other directors are getting exposed to different ideas and different concepts. I still don't know exactly how that translates to most boardrooms, but I think the idea is an interesting one. And it does actually start to segue sort of into skill sets. And I'm going to flip our skill set approach around, and I'm going to start with boards first. So much conversation about what's needed in the board right now. We're going to avoid a lot of that. You can go read a ton about it, but go read a lot about cybersecurity in the boardroom. We're not going to rehash that right now. But I would like to touch on specifically to what we're talking about today: technology innovation and a multi-generational workforce. Shubi, you're a public board director. What do you think we need to be thinking about in that skills matrix in this regard?
So slightly different, I think, in a tech company or a fintech company versus, I think, a non-tech company. But let's just say for a second, focusing on the tech companies. Historically, we've always said that board members do need to demonstrate, like I said earlier, business acumen, strategic acumen, financial acumen, the domain expertise, as well as the functional expertise that they bring to bear to the board. And it was assumed that everybody on the board understood, at least not necessarily be audit committee member, but understand how to read financials, feel comfortable to sign off on the 10Ks and the Qs, right? Like food, water, shelter, basics. You got to have that down. And I am definitely beginning to hear, see, as more and more searches are being done, that digital acumen is becoming a very important part. It's no longer, we have person A, B, C who has this very strong background. Just like you're expected to understand everything from a financial perspective, I think you don't need to be deep experts again. You should have a couple of folks on the board that are the deep experts, but you need to be able to participate because these are big conversations and discussions. Everything from revamping your code of conduct to setting up, your policies. It might be the cyber policies or data policies or even overall AI policies, HR policies. So much is changing. So governance overall across the board is changing. And to be a board member today, I think you have to have that understanding. You don't need to be a digital native, but for sure need to understand.
Digital literacy?
Digital literacy, yeah. And moreover, it's not just understanding it for now and here today. And by the way, I say this with all the love and kindness in the world. Generative AI does not equal AI. So I hear all these people, I banged out 5 prompts today. And I'm like, yeah, great, but that's not AI. That's great, we did that. But that is not AI, right? I mean, AI is much bigger, wider, whether it's robotics and neural networks. And so generative AI is only $2.3 trillion of the $20 trillion is supposed to be by 2025, right? So it's a small percent of it. So it is not only, I think it's board members, it is a bit of a hill to climb to understand what's happening today, but moreover, what's coming in the next 5 years.
Holly, talk to us a little bit about the athletic factor that directors need to bring to the table, maybe more now than before.
So my perception is, and you all have been doing this longer than I have, but the board piece, my perception is that there used to be a value in having very deep, narrow, siloed expertise. And today, I think these board members are needing to bring a level of expertise, but also a level of horizontal athleticism. And so the notion that, that person will cover, and I think that this, by the way, extends from the board all the way down to leadership teams. Yeah. Because what I'm seeing is problem solving is being done in a completely different manner today. It used to be, you're the CISO, go solve that problem, that's your problem. Today, a CISO, a GC, a product leader, a customer leader, an HR leader, they're getting together and solving whatever the problem is for the company. And it's the same at the board level. And so I believe that it's really more about being really strong athletes than being, but also having a domain that you're maybe deep in, but it's not sufficient anymore to just be a narrow subject matter expert.
Yeah, and that brings that inevitably in the conversation, we then have to talk about continuous skilling and relevancy of directors. And I'll go on and tell y'all, moment of vulnerability here. I retired out of a 30-year operational career at the end of 23. I immediately started feeling scared about my relevancy and my knowledge. And I mean, I had just spent 3 decades in Fortune 100 companies doing highly technical jobs, and I was scared to death about my relevancy. And that's real. It's true, because that is how fast things are changing. And while the skills that most CEOs and CFOs practice in their careers, those are evergreen. And all of us are always going to have financial literacy if you're sitting around the board table. There's now this need for digital literacy, but it is such a changing beast more than financial literacy is. I don't think there's necessarily an answer to this. I'm bringing it up to say we have to normalize this in the conversation. As directors, we have to normalize conversation around, here's what I'm doing to learn more. Here's what I'm doing to stay relevant. Here's what I'm doing to share it with you guys. What are you guys doing to come and share it with me? I think education and continuous learning in the boardroom is becoming more of a team sport where we learn and share with each other. And I don't think that happened at all 10 to 20 years ago. So it's an interesting time.
But, as Holly said, you do have to go horizontal in understanding the basics of, let's say, digital acumen and AI, but you do need to now go more deeper in your sector. So if it is robotics, because you're in manufacturing, well, you need to really understand that pretty deep. If you are looking at autonomous vehicles, and if you're in that sector, well, you really need to understand that. So if you're on those, depending on the different board you're on, different companies as company leaders, you need to have a pretty good understanding how to go deep vertically, because doing the whole thing is like boiling the ocean. It's a lot. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of really being strategic about understanding the foundational pieces and then going really deep in your domain.
So what y'all are hearing here is do it all, go broad and go deep, and do it at the same time for 4 different boards. I'm only slightly being facetious here because I think that truly is the mandate that's on us. And we have to figure out what that means and what each of our individual boards needs in that regard, right? So now I actually want to touch, we're getting some great questions come in, and I'm going to flip over to those really soon. But I want to touch real quick on skills in the boardroom are one thing. We need to be looking for and cultivating different skills in the enterprise now. Especially, Shubi, you made the point earlier that a lot of entry-level jobs can be automated more now. So what are we looking for to cultivate, to augment that automation, right? So Holly, I want to start with you. What do companies need to be cultivating?
Yeah. I love this question because it's,
I think you came up with it.
No, I don't. Did I? Oh, great. That's why I love it. No, I love this question because it's evolving so fast and it just keeps changing. I think the first thing I would say is context. Your employees in your companies where your board members are using Gen AI, they're using AI. So if you think they're not, they are. And if there's a policy that says they can't, they'll take it home and do it at home. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is, this new generation of workers is incredibly curious, and they are very invested in feedback and learning and development and their own self-development. So, sort of hard skills, if you think about the hard skills, there's 4 right now you're hearing a lot about. Data literacy, and this isn't like, reading a spreadsheet. This is complex data literacy, the ability to analyze and interpret really complex data. AI and machine learning, we talked a little bit about that. Ethics skills within the company, that's a kind of a new one you haven't heard so much about. So ethics, expertise, and then cyber. So those are hard skills. As a board member, what I would say is they're very expensive. They're in very high demand. If you have a workforce that says you must come to the office 5 days a week and the person lives someplace else, know that it may take you a little bit longer to staff those jobs. So it's not built into your budgets, your operating budgets. Those are great questions to ask. Like, how are you thinking about that? Especially if there's skill gaps in the company. On the soft side, I think that there's several that are really sort of bubbling up and emerging. Collaboration, we talked about it. This notion of, are you a good collaborator in a horizontal manner? Is it one of the things you're known for as a leader? Do you have an innovation mindset? Are you curious? Are you constantly curious? Are you wanting to learn more? Do you use agile practices? How do you think about failure as a method to learn? Judgment and critical thinking, Shubi brought this up, and this is so real. You can't just have a workforce that's curious and doesn't actually know how to do anything. So having that balance of, sorry, that sounded a little harsh. Having that balance of, judgment within the workforce that balances some of this digital native, the digital native skills that are brought forward. And then this may be more of a comment around some of our younger generations, but I think this is so real. How resilient and flexible are you? Because the pace of change has increased so dramatically, and I see a lot more mental health issues bubbling up. If you have operations in Europe, what you're seeing is, I'm feeling very stressed and I'm going on a 6-month leave. By the way, you need to pay me for those 6 months and you need to protect my job. So this has a very specific financial implication where there's a lot more, in the parts of the world where there's a lot more workers' rights and protections. So resiliency and flexibility are the other skills I think are.
And there's an interesting development right now. More states are allowing mental health claims to apply to workers' comp. Traditional workers' comp, where we think about broken legs, whatever, they're now allowing mental health claims. I think that we don't know what those implications are going to be yet, but they are not negligible and they're non-zero from a cost perspective as well. We're going to go on and move into Q&A. There's some great stuff coming in here. And I'm going to start with some questions around specifically people entering the workforce and those entry-level jobs. So, Holly, I think this one is really good for you. People that were getting out of college and starting work the last 5 years, they've had it rough. They had COVID. Not all of them have had the surroundings of an office. Some of them think that's good, some of them not so much. This panel is not about remote work versus work in the office. But given all of these whammies they've had to go through, how do we train and assimilate and invest in these workers that are entering now?
This is a tricky question because I subscribe to the mentality that you're not going to keep them that long. So again, go back to the data. The data says you're going to keep them potentially 1.5 years.
Wow.
They're coming into your world for 1.5 years. Maybe you get them for 2. Maybe if you're really lucky, you get them for 3. If you have a big enough system that allows them to move around and learn. So what do you know about them? You know that they're a little beaten down. So this resiliency factor becomes important. Like, what condition are they arriving in? Are they arriving full on, or are they arriving partially on, or are they completely depleted? So being really mindful in your hiring process about that. Make sure who comes into your container, can withstand your container. The second is, do you have the structure to support their needs? They like a lot of feedback. Tends to be they like most humans, they like good feedback. So how skilled are your leaders at delivering the stuff that doesn't feel so great? And if they aren't very skilled, make sure you've got some mechanisms for them to learn how to deliver feedback that's both positive and maybe not so positive. How are your communication mechanisms within your company? Do you have practices that allow them to frequently give you feedback? And then what do you do with that feedback? Do you communicate to them? Those are just some really practical, tangible things. But I would start from the perspective of how long do you actually, and this is a conversation I don't think is happening very often. How long do we expect to keep them? And what's our plan for when they leave? And if you don't have a plan for when they leave, you just sort of start the flywheel all over again.
Okay. Yeah, good points. Especially that about how their management is trained. Because oftentimes their managers, their first line managers, they're probably not maybe that old themselves. They probably haven't been in the workforce maybe that long.
And in my experience, it's the first time they're managing people. And
Definitely.
in many cases without a lot of support or training.
Good
or
points. Yeah. So you mentioned something that ties into our next question. And Shubi, I think this is a really good one for you. And I'll go on and give an illustration. We're wrestling with this in cybersecurity right now. always, right now, one of the best entry positions in cybersecurity is to have people come join as a security operations analyst. That pretty much means read a bunch of log files, look at a bunch of events, figure out if anything bad happened. It's a great entry level job. It's a terrific way to get in, get started, and then move to harder, bigger, and better things that eventually bring you to a chair with ice water on a very cold day at a golf club in Lakewood. It's great. That job is perfect for AI. In fact, AI is going to be so much better at that job.
Datadog does that.
Exactly, because it's multiprocessor thinking is what that job is. AI is perfect for it. So, Shubi, however, we can't stop there. At some point, the next level analyst who does need to bring that human level in, they're going to retire one day. And what do we do if we don't have anyone who's in that pipeline, right? So, Shubi, how do we think about that balance of still growing a pipeline, but still getting utilization from AI where we can?
Yeah. This is what I was saying earlier. I think the shape of the organization and the skill sets we need. So, as Holly said, we need problem solving. But problem solving, I think today in the world of AI is very different than when I started. So, back in the days when I was a Ford, junior role was pricing analyst. And how did we do pricing at Ford? Hundreds of spreadsheets, right? And if something went wrong though, and if my ears were pulled, at least I knew that I could go back to my spreadsheets and figure out where I made the mistake. But today, how would you do pricing? Machine learning, right? You have all this data and the algorithms are going to figure it out and then you're going to get but if you got the pricing wrong, it's a black box. So how do you figure that out? And I think problem solving today is going to be those analysts who really understand all the assumptions that went into the algorithm and how was the pricing data structured, what was weighted more versus not, what kind of algorithms were used for predictive analytics of the pricing. It's a very different problem-solving approach we would take today for those folks, rather than what, let's say, I did 25 years ago, right?
Okay.
And so that skill set as they grow. So imagine now this analyst becomes a leader. This person or manager, now this person knows exactly how that technology is working, which back in the day, we didn't have to worry about it other than opening
So
up.
you still have entry-level jobs, but they're different.
They're different.
It's not the same as what we've had.
Correct, because you're using different tools.
And we are going to have to go through, there's no easy button for this one.
Nope.
We have to figure out what now means
Yes.
entry-level job.
That's right.
I
And you need the senior leader who has a judgment to be able to look at the output and say, oh, that doesn't look right.
Right. The whole human AI combo.
That
being-
human, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's where the judgment from us comes in.
Yeah.
Ah.
We've got 4 minutes left, and there's 2 areas I really want to touch on. So let's see if we can do this real quick. There's 2 questions that came in, and they're really similar that I'm going to take a very fast answer to. And one is, what are some practical guardrails so that AI can be used, but in a safe way, that the board can and should be aware of? And I think very much related to this, we've got especially younger people coming into the workforce that are used to certain behaviors and activities online that probably are not safe, from a cybersecurity standpoint. How do we deal with that? I think the answer to both of these is very similar. It is amazing how much progress there's been in tools now that are transparent to the user. There's now the concept of an enterprise browser. And if you think about what is an enterprise browser, go look it up. It's I think in 5 years, every company is going to be using this. What it means is, you think about you're at home, you open Chrome, you do stuff on Chrome, you store your passwords, you do whatever. You go to work, you open Chrome, you store your passwords, you do your email, whatever. This is one of the last remaining areas where work and home are so intertwined. And that's incredibly unsafe, by the way. This is how most passwords get harvested now, by things called info stealers. So the rise of the enterprise browser means when you're at work, you're using a different browser. Not just a different instance of Chrome, but you're using something called Island or something called Chromium. And it is possible to, let's say someone opens up Chrome and they try to log into Workday. Your version of Workday won't let them. It only lets them log into Workday if they're using Island, for example. So these are the ways that we can actually redirect and change employee behavior by giving them the right tools that let them do their job. That's the key part. If you stop people from doing their job, they're going to find a way around it. The answer is not no. The answer is how to get to yes, right? And so I think both in terms of AI guardrails, where again, an enterprise browser is great here. You can use an enterprise browser that does not allow ChatGPT access, but does allow access to your own enterprise version of Copilot.
Yep.
Great, safe way to use AI. So I highly recommend transparent tools that still allow the employee to do their job. And the last thing I'm going to wrap with, and this is probably going to have to be a very fast answer, but it's a great question. The different generations and different demographics have a different idea of what ethical use of data is specifically. How do we deal with that? And how should we approach that dichotomy and polarity? It's a good one for you.
Yeah. So I would say the more senior leadership is more focused on impact it will have on reputation, impact it will have on the bottom line, right? That I think is more like that's when you think about the framework. I think the more junior population is also very focused on the individual. You know, is it fair to the person? It's really important. Is it fair to the person? So both are equally ethical, but just on a different spectrum.
Yep. So again, listening and
stating your position as a company.
Great
Stating
point.
your position as a company. Here's our values, and here's what we think. Bye.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. And that, so yes, great takeaway. Understand what your company's definition is, understanding that there can be so many definitions. I mean, we think about, ethical and moral frameworks differ so much by culture. It's the same thing. They differ by demographic in terms of how data is handled.